Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Cohen, and I am the Town of Valney historian, Oswego County, New York. And I'd like to do a little interactive video for you this afternoon regarding one of my very favorite subjects, the Civil War. The American Civil War took place between the years 1861 and 1865. And in particular, I'd like to be concentrating on one particular unit, the 1st Minnesota at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Now, I'm doing this in special little presentation here for a very dear friend of mine, Marty Leon. Marty happens to be, his home state is Minnesota. I'm going to start out this video by just giving you some of my synopsis based on my research that I did on the 1st Minnesota. Now, the 1st Minnesota Regiment was one of the first. Some historians actually say Minnesota was the first to volunteer for service immediately following the first shots being fired at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, even before President Lincoln calls for volunteers. Then Minnesota Governor Alexander Ramsey, he pledges he will raise a regiment for the Union's cause. Now, keeping in mind, Minnesota has only been a United States state for only 3 years at this time. There were lots of firsts about the 1st Minnesota. First of all, they were a 3-year regiment. They were sent to Fort Snelling, Minnesota to do their training. Josiah R. King is the first man to enlist when it was called upon. They were the 1st Brigade, 2nd Division of the 2nd Corps. They serve at the Battle of the 1st Bull Run in Manassas. Then they serve in McClellan's Peninsula Campaign, the West Woods, or Antietam, and then they defend Ricketts Battery on Henry House's Hill, taking very heavy casualties in each one of these campaigns. So that's a lots of firsts for a very small unit from Minnesota. They arrive in Gettysburg on day 2 of the battle with 262 men in ranks, and that would be July 2nd, 1863, at approximately 5:40 p.m. They arrive just in time as the Union's 3rd Corps Army is collapsing. General Winfield Scott Hancock is looking for a unit to stop the Confederate advance due to the General Sickles' bad decision to advance forward without receiving orders. Hancock needs to buy time for reinforcements to arrive. The 1st Minnesota is that unit. General Hancock asks the 1st Minnesota, "Do you see those colors?" Talking about the Confederate colors. "Well, take them." It was written that one of the Minnesotans stated, "Without a word or a tear, we stepped out in an unbroken line." The 1st Minnesota enters Plum Run and runs straight into Wilcox's brigade of Alabamians, which consisted of the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 14 Alabamians. Outnumbered approximately 6-1, the 1st Minnesota charges head-on with Wilcox's brigade. Wilcox had just captured several Union soldiers as well as 2 Union cannons. The 1st Minnesota at this time, they drove them back, but recapturing the 2 cannons, leaving the Alabamians to retreat. And it wasn't without cost, however. The 1st Minnesotans had 82% casualties, which was the largest percentage of any unit during the 5 years of the entire Civil War. On a personal note, Isaac Taylor is killed during this charge, but his brother, Patrick Henry, doesn't know this. Someone tells later Henry that evening that he believes he saw his brother Isaac go down. On the morning of July 3rd, Henry finds his brother and buries him on the battlefield. Henry writes in his brother's diary, "No useless coffin enclosed his breast, nor in sheets nor shroud we buried him. But he laid like a warrior taking his nest, with his sheltered tent around him." 3 days later, Henry writes his family at home of their loss. He signs the letter, "Yours and my country's Henry." Now, the 1st Minnesota, to the man, felt that their lives belonged to their country, but the 1st Minnesota is not done yet. For on the very next day, on July 3rd, 1863, they found themselves right smack in the middle of the battle of the infamous Pickett's Charge, which ended the Confederate chances of victory at Gettysburg. And now I'd like to take a moment and I'd like to give you a little interactive video, which gives a little bit more detail than what I just gave you.
The 1st Minnesota Regiment, part of Harrow's Brigade, Gibbon's Division, within Hancock's 2nd Corps, arrives from the south via the Taneytown Road. With the rest of the brigade, they take up an initial position on the reverse slope of Cemetery Ridge shortly after 8:30 on the morning of Day 2. History takes note of the fact that the 1st Minnesota had only 8 companies available when Hancock ordered their fateful charge late in the afternoon. And it's about 10 a.m. that the first of 2 companies, Company L, is detached. They move to the north to support Woodruff's battery, while the remaining 9 companies stayed in their initial position with Harrow's brigade. As Barksdale was initiating his assault against Union brigades on the Emmitsburg Road, Harrow's brigade, in reserve to this point, was designated to be dispersed to provide support to these 3rd Corps units. Following the 19th Maine, the 1st Minnesota headed southwest and took up a position in support of Thomas's battery to their right and Rorty's battery on their left. As they formed their lines in this new location, Company F was detached and took up a position in the low ground to the front and left of the regiment. The 1st Minnesota's main body was now down to 8 companies containing but 262 men. The Confederates were pushing toward the gap in the Union line. Union General Hancock had sent for reinforcements, but they would not arrive soon enough. All he had to plug the gap stood before him. "My God, are these all the men we have?" exclaimed Hancock. "What regiment is this?" It was the 1st Minnesota, and they were outnumbered at least 6-1. Hancock ordered them to charge. Colonel Colville ordered the regiment forward at the double quick, charging Wilcox's brigade 150 yards down a slight slope, in the thicket to their front. The sight of the 1st Minnesota charging with bayonets leveled caused Wilcox's front line to momentarily fall back to their better ordered support line. The 1st Minnesota halted at the stream bed and fired a volley directly into the faces of their reorganizing foe. Taking cover among the rocks and overgrowth, the firing became general, each man loading and firing independently as fast as they could. But Wilcox's line was longer on both flanks and began to envelop the 1st Minnesota. The left wing of the 9th Alabama pressed the Minnesotans right, and Company I swung back to meet the threat. The 1st Minnesota only survived complete destruction because, as Harry Fonts writes, quote, "Wilcox could not or did not organize a counterattack. His unsupported, advanced position and the threat of more and larger attacks loomed large in his mind, so he ordered his regiments back to avoid destruction or capture," unquote. As Wilcox began to withdraw, Colville saw his chance to take the rest of what was left of the regiment back to the crest of Cemetery Ridge. Only 47 men of the 262 that advanced were present when they eventually collected around their colors. In about 15 minutes, 215 officers and men, 82% of the 8 companies of the 1st Minnesota that charged, had fallen. Hancock later wrote that the regiment had, quote, "sustained the greatest percentage loss of any Union regiment at Gettysburg or during the war." unquote. As a historical footnote, Company F, detached from the regiment prior to the critical engagement with Wilcox's brigade, joined up with the 3rd Corps remnants rallied together by General Humphreys, and took part in the final repulse of Anderson's Confederate division and the recovering of several Union guns. At day's end, Company F rejoined the surviving 47 men of their regiment, taking up a position on Cemetery Ridge, and helped in the fight against Pickett the following day. Company L, which was detached mid-morning to support Woodruff's battery, remained in that position all day at the opposite end of the Union line, and also participated in the repulse of Pickett's charge on day 3.
You would be hard-pressed to find any other regiment or unit that fought any more valiantly than the 1st Minnesota. And that is the story of the 1st Minnesota. To the 1st Minnesota, we salute and honor you for your efforts at Gettysburg.